Hello, kids. This article is about the broad expansion into the West. It covers a lot of time, a lot of eras in history, and starting next week, we're probably going to start filling in the gaps, learning about the buildup of, well, one war in particular, the War of 1812, which established this national identity of what it is to be an American. Star Spangled Banner comes from there. Um, Took a lot of pride in our country over that particular war, um, which is interesting because we didn't really do that well against the British. But this war, this article here does cover a lot of like the Mexican American War. It mentions a few presidents that, as we move closer to the Civil War, we may or may not get back into. So I really like this article to cover a lot about like how families interacted in the West, why people wanted to move out there, different opportunities, specifically the California Gold Rush. Those of you that ever want to move west and make a lot of money, you have that kind of as inspiration. So what I'm going to do, again, same thing. I'm going to read this article to you. This is going to be for Wednesday's assignment, expanding into the West. It will be our last graded large assignment of the 9 weeks. So want to make sure you get this done. So without further ado, here is expanding into the West. A lot of great images here in terms of artwork. So let's get into it. Expanding into the West. In 1800, the United States stretched as far as the Mississippi River, though not all of that land was formally organized into states. Beyond that was land the Americans called unsettled. In truth, though, that land was already home to a diverse group of peoples. The Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole lived in the southeast. The flat Great Plains was the home and hunting grounds of the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Comanche. The Navajo, Pueblo, and Apache lived in the desert southwest. The Shoshone, Paute, and the Nez Perce in the area of the Rocky Mountains, and the Chumash and Chinook along the western coast. Over the course of the 19th century, the frontier, the line that marked the western edge of the United States, moved several times. The movement west was not a steady march from the Mississippi to the Rockies to the Pacific. The frontier was a region of blended cultures, English speakers, Spanish speakers, Native Americans, European and Asian immigrants, and free and enslaved African Americans all met, interacted, and worked out how they would live with one another. Westward migration led to major changes that shaped Americans' self-image and sense of their shared past. The transportation revolution, which again, we've kind of touched on this, but as we expand west, it's going to be even more significant. Significant changes in transportation encouraged westward migration. In the early 1800s, traveling anywhere in the United States was difficult. Most people going west traveled by foot, horseback, or wagon on uneven roads. They traveled along rivers by canoe or flatboat. The national road, paid for by the federal government, marked an advance in land travel. This smooth road, begun in Cumberland, Maryland in 1811, reached as far as Vandalia, Illinois by 1852. Before the road, traveling overland was slow and uncomfortable. The national road made it easier to travel to western cities in the north. Another major transportation breakthrough happened on the nation's waterways. The first came in 1807 when the first steamboats were used on the Hudson River. They were on every American river by 1830. Another advance was construction of the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, which connected New York City, a port on the Atlantic Ocean, to the Great Lakes. By 1840, the United States had 3,326 miles of canals. Rapid land transportation became possible when the first steam railroads were built in the 1830s. By 1860, there were 31,000 miles of track in the United States. The transportation revolution reshaped the way Americans bought and sold goods. Farmers who had once produced crops for their own families now had more ways to get crops for market. They began to purchase goods they once made themselves or lived without. Farmers soon accessed credit through banks. Because there was always a shortage of labor, farmers invested in tools that increased their productivity, such as better plows and mechanical reapers to use at harvest time. The transportation revolution also changed cities. Railroads shortened the time needed to travel long distances and made it easier to carry heavier goods. Eventually, railroads would connect the eastern and western states more easily. The steamboat turned St. Louis and Cincinnati into centers of trade, and Chicago rose as it became the railroad center of the western Great Lakes and Great Plains regions. By 1850, the United States looked very different than it had in 1800. And again, a lot of that is review for us. Just can't underestimate the impact that railroads had on the United States. Filling the East and removing the Indians. America's first western frontier stretched from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. Settlers began pushing east into the Ohio River Valley in the early 1800s. By 1818, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois all had enough people to become states. White Americans in these areas tended to live on family farms, growing corn and raising a few animals. This shift of white settlement came at a price for Native Americans. The Sauk and Fox of Illinois and Wisconsin fought to hold on to their land, but they lost. After their defeat in the Black Hawk War of 1832, they were forced to cross the Mississippi River to Kansas. A similar shift was taking place in the Old Southwest, the region from Alabama to Louisiana. There, the push west was tied to the spread of slavery. Landowners wanted more land to grow more cotton and sugar cane. White Americans found Native Americans, quote, in the way. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had in many ways adopted white culture, but white Americans did not view them as part of their society and culture. Here, too, they thought of these Native American groups as in the way. The United States warred with the Seminoles twice between 1817 and 1842, killing many and driving the rest deep into the swamps of Florida. You got a great image here of Salakta. Read more about him there. The other groups were forced to give up their lands and move west. The Cherokee resisted, even suing the state of Georgia to keep their land. In 1838, however, the United States Army forced the Cherokee to leave their homes in Georgia and move west. The Army acted under the direction of President Andrew Jackson, who you'll learn about when you learn about the War of 1812, who was openly defying a ruling by the Supreme Court. President Jackson met with several delegates from the Cherokee Nation and told them that their, quote, their only hope of relief was in abandoning their country and removing to the west. Of the 16,000 who set out, 6,000 died along the way. Today, the event is remembered as the Trail of Tears. All these Native Americans were settled in what is now Oklahoma, then called Indian Territory, where they had to start their new lives. And again, the Trail of Tears isn't necessarily one of the best parts of United States history. The Louisiana Territory and Oregon Country, stuff that you might already know about. The United States gained access to the land that became Indian Territory in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase. The purchase allowed the United States to double its size. Though Native Americans already lived in the territory, the Louisiana Purchase opened a vast area to American settlement without interference from European colonial powers. The purchase also gave the new country control of a vital waterway, the Mississippi River, and a major port in New Orleans. President Thomas Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore and map the territory that was newly available for Western expansion. Lewis and Clark, along with a party of 40-plus adventurers, explored 8,000 miles of new territory. Their reports about the land, plants, animals, and people helped pave the way for new settlers to move west of the Mississippi. Starting in the 1820s, fur trappers fanned into the Rocky Mountains to trap beavers, whose rich fur was in high demand. In their travels, the trappers gained knowledge of important passes through the Rocky Mountains. Then, in the 1840s, came Oregon fever. Reports of rich farmland in what is now Oregon and Washington called many Americans west. Families traveled in long chains of covered wagons that carried all their goods and hopes along the rugged Oregon Trail, from Missouri to the new promised land. They endured slow progress, disease, hunger, rugged terrain, and dangerous storms on their trek. They crossed the Rockies using the passes the fur trappers had found. By 1848, nearly 20,000 Americans had settled in Oregon. Another interesting map here of just like the expansion of the United States. You see little bits and pieces of what's now modern day Texas. We'll get into Texas history a little bit later on in class. Manifest destiny. Now, I've already had you write about this before, but this concept is going to be still with us. Manifest destiny. This westward migration fed the idea of manifest destiny, a term first used in 1845 by New York journalist John O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan based manifest destiny on three ideas. First, American values and institutions gave Americans a moral claim to the entire continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. Second, people, particularly white American people, had a right and duty to turn untamed nature into productive land in the form of farms and towns. Third, God and the United States Constitution required Americans to spread democracy, Western civilization, and Christianity throughout the world. This belief assumed that Native Americans and Spanish-speaking people living in the West needed to be civilized or, if necessary, segregated or destroyed. Yikes. The idea of manifest destiny, though not given that name until 1845, had been underlying Americans' thinking since colonial times. Manifest destiny became a political force in the mid-1840s. Democratic presidential candidate James Knox Polk, a strong believer in Jacksonian democracy, campaigned in the 1844 election to expand the nation. The Oregon Territory was claimed by both the United States and Great Britain, and Polk vowed to gain sole control of the region. He also pushed to annex or absorb Texas, where American and Mexican settlers had recently won independence from Mexico. Once Polk won the election, outgoing President John Tyler did annex Texas, angering Mexico. In office, Polk put his expansionist policy into action. In 1846, he reached an agreement with Britain that effectively split the Oregon Territory between them. Eager to gain control of California, provoked a war with Mexico. Over the next 2 years, the United States overwhelmed Mexico, forcing a surrender. In the 1848 treaty ending the war, Mexico yielded control of a vast area from Texas to California, north to Utah and Colorado. The United States now extended from sea to sea, fulfilling its manifest destiny. And again, it came at a cost. You got to think about the different people that were there. Still very interesting history. After the Mexican treaty was signed, major news emerged from California. Gold had been discovered. The discovery launched a flood of Americans and immigrants to California, eager to make their fortunes. Those immigrants included thousands of Chinese people, adding a new element to the complex mix of cultures found on the frontier. And I like that advertisement. California, steamship, extraordinary inducements, 35 days to gold regions. 35 days. Unbelievable. Family life in the West. O'Sullivan's dream of creating a democratic Christian West depended on those who picked up their belongings and their families and moved there. Western settlers usually migrated as families and settled along rivers. Settlers carried with them the traditions they had followed back east, including, for some settlers, slavery. Most migrants sought to make a living by farming. Through their lives, they constructed an image of the West as a land of hard-built opportunity that promised personal and national wealth. Then there's the Conestoga wagon, the traditional covered wagon on the Oregon Trail. Interesting picture there. Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, the first person to settle in the area now known as Chicago. Interesting. And it's weird to think about Chicago as being out west, but at this time, technically was. Life on the frontier was not easy. There were no comforts of home. People brought with them what they needed to start their new lives. The greatest threats to the lives of settlers were the elements, the drain of hard work and isolation, and hostile Native American groups. The nature of life in the West changed women's roles. Women at first were expected to follow the same strict gender norms as in the East. These norms included piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. Women were expected to remain in the home. As time went on, however, husbands realized they needed partners to help in setting up homesteads and working the fields. With a greater role in the family's economic life, Western women gained more power in their households. Laura Ingalls Wilder, author of the Little House book series, exemplifies the challenges of life in the West. The Ingalls family moved from place to place in the West as Charles Ingalls, Laura's father, searched for land that could support the family. They eventually settled in South Dakota. Because the family moved so often, Laura was essentially self-educated, though she learned enough to work as a teacher. When she and her husband, Almanzo Wilder, married, she quit teaching to work on their farm. The couple eventually moved from South Dakota to Missouri. Laura kept a journal of their experiences, later using these journal entries as the source material for her books. The Ingalls Wilder family's lives on the frontier were typical of the lives of many settlers. Living in an undeveloped area required hard work and resourcefulness. Bad weather, poor transportation, and hostile Native Americans made life difficult. For the Ingalls Wilder family, there were several winters of near starvation. Only one of Laura and Almanzo's children survived to adulthood, and Almanzo became permanently disabled from diphtheria. Like other settlers, the Wilders succeeded in the West because of their hard work and determination. but success could perhaps best be understood as survival. Yeah. Look, there's a lot to break down here, a lot of good stuff. So, again, stop and start this video as often as you need to help you build your answers. With that being said, hopefully you enjoyed learning about the West. And as we move into next week, we will be learning more about basic events that have led to the development of the United States. Um, um, you've learned about the split between the North and South. You've learned about the new West for today. And there's going to be a few other international conflicts that we'll learn about as we get into our eventual knowledge on the Civil War. So hopefully you enjoyed that. It's a really interesting article, specifically when it starts talking about the expanding role of women, the role of Andrew Jackson and the policies that he put in place. Andrew Jackson's going to be a fellow that we're going to get to know when we learn about the War of 1812. He became quite famous there in the Battle of New Orleans. And he eventually became president. We'll get more into that. I'll stop talking. Enjoy the article. Enjoy yourselves. And like I said, this is the last assignment of this 9 weeks. Let's make sure we get caught up and we get the grades that we want. Have a good one. Bye-bye.